Oh, I have so much to talk about for this episode. I had trouble deciding which questions to use to demonstrate the writing principles for summarized written text, not because there isn't enough, but quite the opposite. There are so many interesting articles that we can go through to demonstrate some cool tricks to make all of our lives much easier. I'm even thinking about doing a second video on this question type, maybe not right away, but soon enough. Let us freshen up our memories on why summarized written text is weird. You had 10 minutes to read a passage and then come up with a written summary. It needs to be between 5 and 75 words, and consider this a must. If you fail to do this, at best, you will get less than half of the total points in the raw score. You will be scored based on content, form, grammar, and vocabulary. Content wants you to talk about the actual passage. Shouldn't be a problem. Form needs one single complete sentence, and we have established its importance. Grammar focuses on getting the structure correct first, and then try to eliminate the other smaller errors. Vocabulary basically means choosing appropriate words from the passage. It doesn't consider spelling, and the officials didn't bother to explain what will happen if you do make a mistake, so I'm not gonna do that either. Then, let's talk about the 3 possible methods that fundamentally achieve similar goals regarding the scoring categories. You had the 6 out of 7 method, copying and pasting the actual sentences in a passage and combining them with conjunctions. Be careful with this method if the sentence structures are complex, because breaking off sentences at invalid locations will likely give you a 0 for grammar. Simple fix: do a little paraphrasing so the trouble can be mitigated. The second method is just pure freestyle. The advantage for this method is that if you get to understand the passage and pick out the right pieces of info, you can make this sentence very short. Less than 30 words will suffice in most cases. You can control the complexity of the structure, and having more control is almost always a good thing. However, this method is quite difficult, especially for students who struggle to understand the core concept of the text. In this case, my super duper awesome schmossum method can be used to save the day. The method goes like this. Spend some time to read the passage and interpret it as much as you can. Then pick out a few pieces that you consider important, which might be based on judgment or pure guess, and come up with a simple summary for them. Afterwards, you look at the passage for 5 minutes and think about why you are so unlucky and didn't get a question that was being predicted. You see some bits that you want to include, so you put them in without making any change to the core structure. Again, using the old analogy, like layers in an onion. You do that a few times and then you will come up with an answer so full and complex, you wouldn't believe that you came up with it by yourself. Let me repeat this one more time. Whichever method you decide to do, the basics are still the same. However you want to answer this question, think critically about whether your answer meets the requirements for content, form, grammar, and vocabulary. All 3 of the aforementioned methods, when used appropriately after some practice, can achieve the same results, even though the answers might seem to be drastically different. That's what I hope to demonstrate by giving you guys 3 versions of answers for each question, so you can make some comparisons and you can freely decide which principal methodology to follow. Here comes the first question. Just like before, pause here if you want to give it a try yourself, and I'll be moving on to the discussion. This first passage is quite simple, and back in the days, this is probably one of those questions that you can actually answer by just copying the very first sentence and call it a day. Rest assured, we will not be satisfied by such a simple approach, not to mention the fact that jury's still out on whether it is still allowed. The very first sentence is indeed quite important, as it covers the essential idea that drone delivery has an environmental advantage over trucks. This, however, is conditional depending on the nature of the delivery, as being briefly discussed in the second paragraph. If the delivery route is short and has few stops, then the drones will outperform the trucks in terms of environmental impact. The third paragraph is basically a reverse of the previous one, focusing on the benefits of truck delivery when the delivery route is long and has frequent stops. The last paragraph gives some examples of small items that suit drone delivery especially well. Lastly, it mentions another crucial prerequisite for drone delivery to be feasible. The weight of the parcel has to be relatively low. Otherwise, it will be too much of an effort for the drone to stay airborne. This can be seen as an additional condition for the drones to be a better choice of delivery over trucks, apart from the delivery route itself. If you decide to use the 6 out of 7 method, your answer should be something like this. A few observations here. This answer has 68 words, which is kinda pushing it. Once again, I had to take out a small portion in the second part, so I won't go over 75. If you are already being forced to make some changes, then why not just do a little more as you would for the other two methods? Delete a few more things and add in some others, and there you go. Remember that you have 10 full minutes to spend on this one question, and the saved time doesn't get carried over to other writing questions, so why not make a slightly bigger effort? Another interesting fact is that I basically just copied 2.5 paragraphs out of the total 4 in the passage. I get to do this because this question is quite short, and thus the amount of info is minimal. This is another reason why you would want to consider doing something else when you get a longer passage. The 75 word count is a hard cap, so good luck trying to copy half of the passage when it is doubled the length of this one. Again, you don't have to completely alter your way of doing things, but be more flexible and learn to recognize when changes are called for. Ready for the flex? Here we go. A short answer that covers all the basic details, and it is 29 words long. If you look at published practice materials, you will almost always find a sample answer for summarized written text questions that is less than 30 words long. It doesn't mean you can't get over 30 words. After all, the officials say you can have as many as 75. The point I'm trying to make is that usually you can cover all the essential details in under 30 words. Not only is it definitely achievable, it is sometimes encouraged if you can get a good understanding. For a longer passage, directly copying and pasting sentences might work less efficiently, so my suggestion would be to at least understand the fundamentals of this methodology as well, so you can execute some simple changes when you need it. Let's do the onion now. I'm too lazy to look for a better expression, but you get what I'm saying. This is a very concise summary of the entire passage. Of course, it is only natural to talk about what the conditions actually are. Since there are multiple reasons, the most sensible structure is a parallelism. I'll give you 3 different versions in terms of structure, one with a preposition, one with a clause, and one with a conjunction. Didn't see that coming, did ya? It is completely up to you as to which one to go for. They are all correct, and they convey the exact same message. As to personal preference, I like the clause version more than the other two. Don't ask me why. There's no ironclad logic here whatsoever. I just like the to be version. You Chinese people will understand what I'm talking about. Let's expand further using this one. I would like to include the fact that the advantage in this context specifically talks about carbon emission or environmental impact, so this should probably show up in your answer. We can put that in right now. I chose to say carbon emissions but not environmental impact simply because I like it more. Again, no ironclad logic here, it's just a personal choice. On a different day, I can totally go the other way. One more observation before we move on to the next question. I picked the clause version to expand upon, but what's stopping you from including this addition with lower carbon emissions to the other 2 versions? As we mentioned before, when adding stuff into the sentence, the added parts usually don't overlap and affect each other. You might go with a different order to put them in, you might choose different phrasing, or you might opt for completely different things to put in. I still like my answers the best, but if your version works in terms of the scoring categories as well, I don't really care. On to the next question. This passage begins with quite a scary word. Please recall in the Retail Lecture Crash Course video that has a sample question talking about schizophrenia. The scary words don't really matter, and oftentimes they are explained in the passage using simpler terminologies. Don't ever trip over individual words. In fact, one thing you can do for summarized written text is just include this word somewhere in your answer. You can almost guarantee that this word is important. It's the first word of the entire question, and you probably don't know what it means. Good stuff. What does it mean exactly? The very first sentence explains it all. It is a condition that your body temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius, or 95 degrees Fahrenheit for you Imperial System fanatics, so your body gets too cold. This word is something that you can practice how to break a word apart and interpret it piece by piece. The prefix hypo is not too uncommon. It means low. A word ending with "ia" is probably a disease or illness. Remember schizophrenia? Yeah, that. What about the middle part, therm? Do you see this spelling in other words, maybe like thermal, thermometer, thermostat, geothermal, and thermodynamics? They seem to be getting more complicated, which is not very helpful. Therm means heat. So a literal interpretation of the word hypothermia is simply an illness that the heat runs low. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? As a little side note, what is hyperthermia? The prefix hyper is exactly the opposite of hypo, so hyperthermia is precisely a fancy way of saying fever. How cool is that? You're being tricked into learning awesome vocabulary that has nothing to do with the question. Once you get through the first word, the passage is nothing too difficult for you to handle. Let's quickly go through the text. After briefly explaining what hypothermia is, the first paragraph then explains what the natural human body temperature is. This is what I meant when I said once you get over the scary words that show up occasionally, you really have nothing else to worry about. Then the passage also explains that it doesn't need to be freezing for you to lose heat, it just needs to be colder than your body temperature. Like, duh. The second paragraph contains a few more details. It mentions 2 ways of heat generation in the body. Sounds like important stuff, so you should include them in your answer. Later on, the passage has a list of 4 ways for the body to lose heat. I would just consider including the 4 names of the involved mechanics, but not their tedious explanations. Once again, if you can find a way to follow the requirements of this question when putting in those details, be my guest. I would just leave them out because they don't appear to be significant, and more importantly, I don't like them. Let's first show what the 6 out of 7 method will give you. Yikes, this one is really pushing it. This answer has 74 words in it. Again, I had to do a little paraphrasing at the end to include the 4 ways for heat loss, but please make sure that you can at least do this much. I changed the hyphens in the original passage to commas simply because I am not entirely sure whether hyphens are acceptable punctuations, so just don't risk it. Also, I'm pretty certain that you can't type out the degree symbol during the test, so just change degrees Celsius to the word degrees. Easy fix. Now, can you flex this answer? Here's one way. This answer is slightly longer at 39 words. If you want, you can certainly trim it down to fewer than 30, but for this particular passage, it has a bit more info than the last question, so it makes total sense for the summary to be slightly longer. Whichever method you decide to use, the suggested word count is, like the name suggests, a suggestion. It can definitely vary, usually depending on the complexity of the passage, how much time you have left, and whether you feel like it. So, the considerations I used when developing my method. How is it not beautiful that I can always find a way to promote my own methodology? Let's do some evolution, starting with a very simple sentence. Very much in its early stages, it definitely needs some fine-tuning and additions of extra stuff. Let's do a new structure called an appositive, which is somewhat like a parallelism, but instead it is a direct equal to part of a sentence. This is a good example to show how this structure works. For the sentence to work correctly, you can just have hypothermia, like we demonstrated in the previous version, or you can just have a medical condition. They are a bit like synonyms, but the appositive serves the purpose of elaboration, and it also adds more places for you to expand upon. Now, if you want to further explain what the medical condition is, you can do it in the appositive instead of after hypothermia, like this. I chose to not include the number 35 degrees Celsius, but make sure that you know how and where to do it if you want to. I'll give you a hint. You have multiple structures available, but you should probably have it behind too low. What about the rest of the first paragraph where it mentions the fact that you don't need to be in sub-zero environments for hypothermia to occur? I usually would just ignore this bit, but for the sake of demonstration, I will include this one. It doesn't fit anywhere in our current version, so it's a good chance for us to have a compound sentence with a conjunction. Lastly, let's put in the ways for heat to be generated and to be lost, and we are pretty much done. 2 simple prepositional phrases that use the original words in the passage, and since there are multiple terms for both, parallelisms would do the job perfectly. Here's the last question. This one kinda represents the maximum length and intensity you can expect during the test. For these long passages, it is even more important for you to be able to tell which parts are insignificant. Let's go through that passage again, and while we are doing this, let's strike out the unnecessary bits. First would be the names of the people and the institutions. What they said or did are a lot more interesting than whatever last name they happen to have. If you have those names or institutes in your answer, I will hate you forever. You know what? Let's just remove them directly. They have zero contribution to how we would approach this question. Hasn't this just become a lot more manageable? The next difficulty will probably be the word siesta, which shows up quite frequently, and hence it seems to be the main idea. If you take another closer look, you will see that another keyword also pops up throughout the entire passage: napping. These two are interchangeable in this context. There is a slight difference, but for now you can regard them as exactly the same. The first paragraph mentions death to heart disease, and the second paragraph has a fancy term, coronary mortality. You guessed it, they pretty much mean the same thing as well. Then there come the two passages with some numbers. Remember that exactly what the numbers are do not matter. 23,000, it means a lot. 30% less likely, a big decrease. 650,000 also means a lot. Number 1 means, well, number 1. The next two paragraphs are pretty much useless, so we can ignore them completely. The seventh paragraph explains why taking naps can help with reducing the risk for heart disease. It gives two main reasons, the first being relieving stress, and the second being fitting to the biological rhythm. Who said this exactly? Was it Demetrius, Gerald, or Michael? Who cares? The last paragraph explains that this study was actually the first to produce a positive result. In comparison, I would say the last sentence is a bit more important. It mentions that this study tries to account for many other factors that are also thought to affect the rates of heart disease. Whether to put them in is largely dependent on your own discretion. If you think you have enough stuff to write, feel free to leave them out. But once again, learn how it can be done so it will come in handy when you need it. First, let's do the 6 out of 7 method. Another very close one at 73 words. If you look back to the original text, you can see that I am being extremely picky about which sentence to include in my answer. This is a big problem for the 6 out of 7 method. The longer the passage is, the more careful you will need to be, and it's less likely to work if you have to resort to picking sentences randomly. Do not think that the 6 out of 7 method is a replacement for understanding the passage. It is only a style for you to write the answer. Let's move on to the flex. Once again, it is slightly over 30 words at 36, but this is a result of trying to include as many useful info as possible. Longer passages should call for longer summaries, which makes a lot of sense. Lastly, the onion. The very core structure should be something like this. Can't really get any simpler. If you start off simple, then chances are you will need more conjunctions and clauses instead of prepositions, because the first two are more diverging and nonlinear. Just throwing in some mathematical terms here to show that everything is connected one way or another. Usually I would not ever consider including the word study, but since this entire passage is about the findings of a specific study, it should be mentioned somewhere. This is probably the most difficult transformation that you will ever encounter. I changed the original sentence into part of a noun clause. The terminology is a lot scarier than what it is. This structure should be something very familiar to you. Many students might forget that, and it will lead to the grammar taking a heavy hit because leaving it out will mess up the structure, so be careful. How exactly napping reduces the risk seems to be important, so let's put it in. Note that I didn't use a comma before because the use of commas for conjunctions is quite convoluted, but a good practice for such structures is to just use one if you're not sure. You cannot, however, put a comma before the next conjunction end because it is not used to link sentences, but to parallelize parts of sentence. Even during the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19, heart disease still seems to kill more Americans. Let's include that. An interesting note, we didn't have a comma before because, but now we do, because we have another clause in front of it. It all just works out beautifully, doesn't it? I chose to go with a number simply because writing out hundreds of thousands is a lot of work. Just being practical and a bit lazy here. Can we mention the fact that the study was done on Greeks? Why the hell not? It's not like it's that important, but I had 2 cans of Mountain Dew earlier today, so I'm in a good mood. A simple preposition that does the job. You know what? I'm in such a good mood that I like to end this video with 3 versions for the last layer. Let's add in the fact that this study considers many other different factors. 3 different methods coming right up. That makes it 3. There are definitely other acceptable ways to do the exact same thing, so it's completely up to you. The first and second versions use insertions of prepositional phrases, and the third is a clause. All of them are a little over 40 words, so it's another clue that we have covered enough stuff from the passage. If you're still wondering whether it was Demetrius, Geralt, or Michael who said, wait, what was the message again? Who gives a damn? That'll be all for today. Please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends if this video has been helpful. Next up, we'll be moving on to write essay, the reason why I lost 3 points on written discourse. Expect some hate in the next video. Until then, just as I might feel difficulty to breathe when facing racism, please don't turn George Floyd's heartbreaking demise into an excuse to exert violence and commit crime, which serve no good purpose but to further perpetuate the hatred and chauvinism. Apologies for the pun, and I'll see you all next time.